Episode 1. It's April 9th, 1865. The Civil War, in essence, is over. The Union has defeated the Confederacy after the surrender of General Robert E. Lee. No, what's this? Abraham Lincoln's being killed by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater just 6 days later. So what do the Republicans do now? The face of emancipation has now officially been gone, as the nation mourns for one of the greatest presidents in U.S. history. Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat and former vice president, becomes inaugurated as president of the United States, and he immediately presents a plan to reconstruct the nation. But there are growing schisms between the moderate approach that Andrew Johnson wants to take in contrast to the radical Republicans, which include Charles Sumner, Benjamin Wade, and more. You see, there's a big difference in stance between these two parties. President Johnson, in accordance with the opinion provided by Lincoln, believes that the South's secession was not legal and hence they never left the Union, implying that they retained the right to a certain level of self-government. In this interpretation, he does not want to grant full voting rights or provide governmental positions to blacks, especially as his personal speeches imply his belief in white supremacism. On the other hand, radical Republicans believe the South seceded and hence want a harsh punishment on the state, overturning the entire social system by granting blacks significant rights that they hadn't entertained prior. With additional congressional power in 1866, with a sweep of both the House and the Senate, they started their business. With the Freedmen's Bureau and the 1867 Military Reconstruction Act, they implemented measures to assist African Americans' rights to vote, delivered food to them, and helped them gain labor contracts, with the support of northern white philanthropists. They also intended to desegregate schools and provide African American offices in government. By implementing the federal military to occupy the states, these measures were forcefully put in place. But Johnson still prevented major changes by illegalizing measures to provide land for African Americans, a quintessential aspect for economic independence. So newly freed men had to depend on sharecropping or crop lien, which borrowed materials and land on credit in exchange for obtaining a portion of the crops the African Americans had cultivated. But with high interest rates by the white owners, it would be impossible for freedmen to find complete independence. And with the economic slowdown in 1873 due to a recession in Europe, radical Republicans slowly and surely began to lose power and influence. There were overstated claims and corruption by African American members of Congress, including inflated salaries and using state revenue to buy ham or perfume, which were made to prevent the further influence in government. While this was true in very minute numbers, it was the expected amount of corruption in US government in 19th century America. But other scandals, such as the whiskey ring scandal in 1872, when associates of now President Ulysses Grant were siphoning money off of whiskey excise tax, further weakened Republican control. The Credit Mobilier of America scandal in 1873 also marks another turning point. The company was paid to create the Transcontinental Railroad, but instead bought railroad bonds and resold them at high profits. Several congressmen, including Vice President Schuyler Colfax, accepted bribes to forestall the inquiry. When that became known, the Republicans started gaining a reputation of corruption. Not only that, the white supremacist sentiment only grew large in the South with the establishment of local militia groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which systematically attacked blacks, prevented them from voting, owning arms, and receiving education by burning public schools. So when the 1876 election had results that were unclear, the Compromise of 1877 came in which Republicans relinquished the military presence in the South, gave more flexibility to state self-government, and provided federal aid for railroads. But that marked the end of the Reconstruction in the United States in an incomplete state. It would not be completed until a century of protests and the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. But wait, what if Lincoln hadn't died? What if he remained in office? Would things have been different? The question remains and is unclear, essentially because Lincoln did take a more lenient stance like Andrew Johnson. But let's go back. Let's rewind. It's April 9th, 1865. But Lincoln does not die. In fact, he does not even go to Ford's Theater. He just stays at home. According to comments made at the Hamptons Road Conference, a meeting designed to discuss terms on ending the Civil War in February 1865, it was clear that Lincoln's two main goals were the emancipation of all slaves and the re-establishment of the Union, and that there would be no compromise on those matters. However, he still held a much more magnanimous approach, unlike the radicals who wanted to overrun the South. He indeed offered $400 million in compensation for the freedom of the slaves, which in reality was only offered to the District of Columbia due to the South's rejection of his proposal. His cabinet did oppose any compensation, but Lincoln's liberality to the South's secession is clear. Regardless of the morality of slavery, the undeniable fact is that slaves had value on the market, and the immediate emancipation makes those investments completely worthless. So as did many other nations in the process of abolition, compensation was usually provided to ensure some sense of fairness to slave owners. The delay of the Emancipation Proclamation to 1863 also remarks the very fact that he had not been like his radical peers who argued for the complete demolition of the South. The Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, which he also stated that amnesty would be provided to those who, until this point, which is 1863 December 8th, had supported the Confederacy, retained all rights to property and would be pardoned by the president. But the liberality disappeared on the immediate outset of his death, especially in the form of an assassination from Southern sympathizers. Perhaps in an alternate future, where Lincoln is well and alive to lead the Reconstruction, should we have seen a peaceful movement towards equality without the radicals inciting a reactionary response by white supremacists. And perhaps then we could have experienced a more stable transition to African American civil rights and have prevented the tensions that remain today. But wait, there's one other perspective that is also possible. To understand this, we'll rewind a bit more. 1862 and the early outbreak of the war. The slave state of Maryland did not secede, but there were violent outbreaks by Confederate sympathizers, so the Union was worried that it would join the Confederates. They could not risk losing the state, as supply lines from D.C. went through a railroad in the state. Here's where the problem comes. Under the U.S. Constitution, in Article 1, Section 9, it guarantees habeas corpus in which people can appeal unlawful detention. But in times of war, there is a suspension clause which allows the federal government to temporarily restrict that right, without clear clarification on whether the president may do so without the support of Congress. So on April 27th, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and allowed his General Winfield Scott to arrest Confederate sympathizers and congressmen. The Baltimore mayor, the entire city council, the board of police, and the police commissioner were all arrested without charges. John Merriman, a plantationer who owned slaves, was one who was arrested but appealed because there was no direct conflict in Maryland at the time. So when the case ex parte Merriman was brought to Chief Justice Taney, yes, the same Taney who said that African Americans were not citizens in Dred Scott v. Sanford, pronounced that the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus could only be enforced by Congress and that Lincoln had exceeded his executive powers. But Lincoln ignored Taney and continued to enforce it, with Congress officially agreeing only 2 years later. And in 1864, he suspended habeas corpus once more against all those who discouraged military enlistment or aided the Confederates, all charged under martial law. Lincoln allowed arbitrary arrests and detention for the purpose of silencing dissenters who argued that the Confederacy should become independent and that the war was unjust. Why does any of this legal jargon matter? Well, if you look at the 1866 Supreme Court decision ex parte Milligan, it was determined that the president could not enforce martial law when civilian courts are available, putting Lincoln on potential impeachment crimes. Of course, the Senate would have to impeach him legally, but he may have overridden his powers as the President of the United States. Well, historians have argued that this use of force was necessary for greater good, for emancipation and the preservation of the Union. But what if someone who was not as wise became President of the United States and arbitrarily arrested civilians? What would be the repercussions? There is a concept of stare decisis, where a precedent is in place and acts legal in the past are legal today. If Lincoln were to live and were to remain in presidency, it would set a precedent where the Suspension Act is provided to the president. Would Americans stand by if a new president, a demagogue per se, came in and arbitrarily arrested civilians or silenced the press? It would set up a recipe for disaster. So, what if Lincoln lived? Who knows? But the failures of the Reconstruction and the excessive use of force become critical questions that we must answer for the future stability of our government.